The Fairy Dance arc is so bad. There are so many tropes, so much stupid crap that doesn't need to be there, and just so many useless characters. Not to mention a horrible protagonist, a garbage villain, and a completely awful plot. This is why Fairy Dance is awful. Now, before we begin, I just want to preface this. Everyone is into their own things, and if you like SAO as a whole, I won't judge. A lot of this is just my opinion. But there are some serious problems in Fairy Dance that I don't think anybody should be okay with. I also know that a lot of people have already covered this topic, but I'm hoping that I can provide a unique look at Fairy Dance. I'll be taking a look at this through a writer's perspective. I myself am a writer and I've written a few novellas, so I want to view Fairy Dance through a storytelling lens. Another thing is that I really quickly want to mention two YouTubers that have influenced my opinion of Fairy Dance, and that's Mother's Basement and Anime America. They both have great content, and I highly recommend you check them out. Now, with that being said, let's get this over with. I'm going to start with a bit of an overview. The Fairy Dance arc is the second arc of SAO and runs from episode 15 to episode 25. It is the most painful 11 episodes of anime I have ever watched. Though there are many things to pick apart, there are a few things that are good about the arc. The animation is good, sometimes, and the pacing is okay for the first 3 episodes, but that's all it has going for it. I also think the voice actors do a good job for the most part, but they aren't given the best lines to work with. Besides that, this arc has almost nothing else to offer. All of the characters are trash, the plot is abysmal, and the fight scenes are some of the worst I've ever seen. Eugene is such a pointless character. The fight between Eugene and Kirito is the worst fight scene of them all. Besides the one. Kirito is super OP and literally cannot lose. He pulls the most bullshit stuff out of his ass. It's so dumb. Eugene is also a terrible villain, meant to look super OP, so that Kirito looks like a badass when he beats him. The other characters just sit in the sidelines and watch the fight. It would be infinitely more interesting if it was a massive brawl between the heroes and the salamanders. It would give the other characters some time to shine and show off their skills. This fight also has no bearing on the main plot besides getting Alicia and Sakia involved when raiding the World Tree. That's it! Your subplot should have some level of impact on your characters, but we don't see that here. Just a plotline that amounts to nothing. Sigurd is also shit. He's literally only there to have a weak villain to help advance the plot and look like a douche, so Kirito can take the moral high ground and provide poetic words of wisdom to him early on. His plotline of working with the salamanders is also pretty stupid and doesn't really leave an impact on the story. If there's something established in a story, no matter how minute, a writer can use it later in the story, and if done well, it can add more payoff to your story. This principle is known as Chekhov's gun. Reki Kawahara does not do this. Instead, he introduces Sigurd early on and then uses him in a plot point that's completely irrelevant to the main objective. Then he's exiled from Sylph territory, never to be heard from again. Villains need to have more impact than this. A more interesting approach would have been if Sigurd was a jerk to Kirito early on, but then helped him later when fighting the salamanders. Alicia and Sakuya are also barely present. They are relevant for the peace negotiations and during the raid on the World Tree, and not much else. They have some presence in Girls Ops and also make cameos in Mother's Rosario later, but that is the extent of their relevance. Their main purpose is to help out Kirito as he fights his way up the World Tree. That's it. And then there's Recon. Literally the most useless side character there is. He has one cool scene and then becomes completely irrelevant. We also can't forget that none of the characters from Aincrad make a return until the end of the arc, besides Agil, but only to advance the plot by showing Kirito ALO. That itself is not a bad thing, as changing the cast of characters can be an effective way to introduce new characters and a new setting. But when the cast from Aincrad themselves aren't developed well, adding more characters is only going to make it worse. Now that we've gone over some of the minor characters, next I would like to talk about some of the major characters. We'll start with Leafa. Leafa isn't a great character, but there's a lot that could be done with her. For starters, she's mostly used as fan service, which isn't a great reason to write a character. If you're going to write a character into the story, it needs to be for a better reason than to appease certain fans. Like many side characters in SAO, Leafa isn't really developed well. When writing side characters, especially ones as major as Leafa, you really want to develop them as much as you can. Your story can't just be about your main character when there are other characters to focus on. So instead of Leafa being a rounded, dynamic character that the audience can enjoy, she's left as a flat and static character, like most of the characters in SAO. The one storyline that Leafa does get isn't even that good. It's honestly disturbing. Her whole love arc with Kirito is just bad. I get that it's more of a common trope in certain Japanese media, but still, it's not great. Mother's Basement mentions this plotline in one of his SAO videos, and I implore you to check those out. They are very insightful. My favorite interpretation of Leafa is actually from SAO Bridge by Something Witty Entertainment, which I also highly recommend. Leafa's main arc in A Bridge is that she's upset with Kirito for ditching her when they were younger and spending all of his time alone. That caused a rift between the two and unironically makes both of these character stories way more interesting. Coming at this storyline from that angle is probably the best way to fix it and make Leafa an interesting character. Overall, while Leafa is handled extraordinarily poorly in Fairy Dance, she is far from the worst character in this arc. Now, I would like to discuss the total character assassination that is Asuna. This one hurts me. As many problems as she has in the anime, I really do like Asuna. I like her design, I like where they were going with her in the Aincrad arc, and I really like her in Progressive, especially in the first Progressive movie. I do have a little bias as I am a big fan of her English voice actress, Jeremy Lay. Sita is my favorite Fire Emblem character, and I think she has done a great job of voicing her in recent Fire Emblem games. I also think she does a good job as Asuna, though Fairy Dance doesn't really let her shine nor give her much to work with. Asuna really doesn't get to do a whole lot throughout Fairy Dance, which is just so stupid. She's the deuteragonist of the SAO series and plays a key role in the Aincrad arc. There, she's one of the few characters besides Kirito that actually gets some attention, but of course it doesn't last. In Fairy Dance, she is relegated to nothing more than a damsel in distress. Now, there is a character that you can write, and I will admit that I'm a sucker for these kinds of stories. If the characters are fleshed out well enough and the plot is interesting. This indeed could have been done well, but it wasn't. Asuna tries to escape about halfway through the arc, and I honestly enjoyed this part of Fairy Dance. Having Asuna be shown as tough while in captivity could have been a great way to let her character shine. Then the scene in the lab happens. I don't know why tentacle rape is such a common trope in anime. I mean, it literally happens again to Leafa in War of the Underworld. This scene is pretty bad, though I definitely think the climax is worse. And in any case, A Bridge still does a better job not only portraying this scene, but Asuna's character as a whole. Again, please go watch SAO Abridged. Anyways, the weird octopus scientists take Asuna back to her cage, but of course she manages to grab the most convenient plot device imaginable. I still wonder why they would just leave the keycard sitting there, but whatever. She throws the keycard to Kirito after hearing Yui's voice, and they make their daring entrance into the World Tree. Riveting. Reki Kawahara completely assassinated Asuna's character. She went from being the strong female lead to being nothing more than a damsel in distress that gets zero character development. And the worst part is that there was so much potential for her character, especially with what happens to her during the climax. But I'll discuss that a little later. Next, I want to talk about one final character. Kirito. Where do I begin? Kirito genuinely might be one of the worst anime protagonists of all time. He's written in such an uninteresting way. In any story, your characters need to be interesting. The audience needs a reason to care about your protagonist, whether it be through their character development or their personality, etc. Kirito has none of that. His personality isn't that enjoyable, and he certainly doesn't have any character development. Kirito barely even changes throughout the entire series, and it makes him a really boring character to watch. His personality is also just a typical anime protagonist who wants to protect his friends and save the day. Ultimately, my biggest problem with Kirito is how OP he is. It completely ruins any likability he could have had. In a story, your main cast should struggle a little. It adds conflict to the plot, making it more interesting, and allows your characters to overcome challenges that may help to develop them, whether it be to flesh out their backstory or to show them changing and growing as people. Kirito never does this. He wins almost every fight he's ever in. The only time I can ever recall him struggling in a fight is in his first fight with Heathcliff, which was a good way to show that Kirito wasn't the best. It allowed him to show weakness. He rarely shows weakness after that scene, as he's too powerful to lose, like in the final battle with Heathcliff and against Eugene. When we do see weakness from Kirito, it's usually forced, like in the final battle of Fairy Dance. Some of you may be familiar with the term Mary Sue or Gary Sue, but essentially it's a character that lacks any flaws or weaknesses. And that is a perfect definition of what Kirito is. He lacks any major flaws and really doesn't have any weaknesses that would cause him to struggle in any realistic way. Kirito is written to be the strong MC who can win any fight he's ever in with little personality outside of that. This doesn't let Kirito change and grow. He remains a static character all throughout the series. In a story, something must change throughout the course of the story. And that could be your characters or the world around them. None of that happens though. SAO, ALO, GGO, none of them leave a lasting effect on the world, and it makes the story less interesting. It's like the characters forget about what happened in the previous arc and move on. Kirito himself barely changes, and it makes the audience less inclined to be interested in the character. There are numerous ways to fix Kirito's character, and easily the best way is to give him an actual obstacle to overcome. There is one plotline that could really work for Kirito, and that's for him to have to overcome PTSD from SAO. The time that the character spent in SAO really didn't impact them in any meaningful way. And in fact, most of them seem nostalgic about the experience. Why not have Kirito be hesitant to enter ALO, as that would give him an initial challenge in just the first few episodes of the arc? You could then depict him having panic attacks while in game. That would convey his struggle and would give him something to overcome. It would make his character richer. But no. Instead, they tried to write a badass MC that's way too overpowered. And a character can be badass and still win well. Yer Glow from Tales of Vesperia is a great example of a badass character done well. There are many scenes where Yuri does some really badass shit, but they also allow him to show weakness. Yuri doesn't win every fight. He struggles all throughout the game, and that's what makes him such a cool character. The fact that he can persevere through extremely tough situations, not because he's an OP badass that can defeat any enemy in his path. Kirito has numerous issues with this character, and that warrants a video in and of itself, but now I think it's time to move on to... Before we can talk about the climax, first we have to talk about Oberon. Sugo, or Oberon as he's known in ALO, is the main villain of the Fairy Dance arc. And he sucks! This is one of the worst villains I have ever seen. He's a two-dimensional character who barely contributes anything of worth to the plot. Throughout the arc, Sugo is depicted tormenting Asuna while in her cage. He constantly acts weird around her and constantly harasses her. The plotline that I'm the most upset about, though, is his plot to control Asuna. He traps several hundred people in ALO to experiment on their brains in an attempt to control their emotions and memories. This plotline is very fragmented and is extremely convoluted and pointless. Nothing is done with it. If we got more details about what exactly he was doing, or showed him actually working on it instead of just showing us what was going on in the lab, then we could have a better understanding of what is actually going on. Instead, we barely see Sugo outside of Asuna's cage, and this plot is inserted into the climax to artificially create stakes and tension. And it still fails! Sugo barely has any relevance in the story, and it begs the question, why does he exist? All Sugo does is create a sense of urgency for Kirito to get to the top of the tree. He is meant to be this powerful villain who has the perfect plan and can't be stopped, giving Kirito a large obstacle to overcome. But his only personality traits are that he is narcissistic, hates Kaiba, and wants to marry Asuna. That's it! Not much else is done to develop his relationship with Asuna's father or the scientists that are helping him. Maybe explore his past with Asuna. Give us something! Quick fun fact. Some of you may know this, but I just wanted to say that Oberon and Titania are actually real characters from fiction. Specifically, they are from A Midsummer Night's Dream, a play written by William Shakespeare. Funny enough, in that play, the two are estranged as Oberon wants a boy that is with Titania to be his knight, and to get him, he has someone put a flower's juice on her eyelids while she's sleeping, which will force her to fall in love with the first living thing she sees. Oberon trying to control who Titania falls in love with? Gee, I wonder where I've heard that before. I find it interesting how much Reki Kawahara took from different mythos, but I'll discuss that more in a minute. The actual plot doesn't make much more sense. Kirito and Yui manage to make it to the top of the world tree and finally find Asuna. They rush towards Asuna's cage, and when they get there, we see Asuna look up and see Kirito and Yui at long last. For as many things as Fairy Dance gets wrong, I actually really do like this scene. Asuna's reaction to seeing Kirito and Yui is honestly quite sweet, and it's also believable considering what she's had to go through up to now. While this whole sequence is sweet, it is completely ruined by what happens next. After something happens to the ground, the scenery completely changes to a glowing platform along with the sky going dark. I honestly have no clue what's happening here. I know that Sugo deploys gravity magic to prevent them from moving, but other than that, I have no clue what's going on. You have to make it clear to the audience what's happening and why. Don't make it vague. If you confuse your audience, they won't be able to keep up with what's going on. And that can make them uninterested in the remainder of the story. Before we continue, I do want to give a quick warning. The next section of the video will be discussing sexual assault and rape. If this topic is uncomfortable to you, you may want to skip this part of the video. You can skip to the timestamp on screen to skip to the rest of the video. Before we talk about that scene, I would like to discuss a scene from earlier in the arc. The scene in the lab with the scientists. This entire scene is just disgusting, and the only relevance the scientists have to the arc at large is this scene. The only things we see them do is work in the lab, catch Asuna, see one logging out to consult Sugo, and the other sexually assaulting Asuna before they take her back to her cage. The only use the villains have is to stop Asuna from logging out and to sexually assault her. Why? Why are they here? You can't just write about sexual assault for the sake of having it. And the fact these characters have no other purpose is utter nonsense. Seriously, Reki Kawahara, learn how to write a fucking good villain for once! Now we have to talk about that scene. Probably the worst scene in all of SAO. There have been way worse depictions of sexual assault in SAO, but this is the one that really started it all. Yui disappears for some reason, and at last Sugo appears. He acts very cocky and narcissistic from start to finish, and it really doesn't help his character any. Throughout the fight, he talks about how he's the god of ALO and can't be stopped! Shit like that. Asuna tells Kirito to log out and bring this conspiracy to light. But of course, Sugo took away Kirito's ability to log out. He chains up Asuna and impales Kirito. Many of you have already seen the scene or have seen people discuss it, but for those unaware, Kirito's on the ground, helpless to do anything. To test the effects of how pain in-game can affect someone in real life, Sugo turns the pain absorbers down to level 8. And here, folks, we have our climax, and so far, the climax has barely been a climax. There's forced tension, sure, but nothing that will truly hook the audience. This next part is really what makes me upset. Sugo begins to run his hands all over Asuna, from her arms to her thighs, and he also begins to strip her clothes. I will remind you that she is 17! You can definitely have this plot in the story, but there has to be more nuance than this! I will also mention that Asuna does try to stay strong during this whole scene, saying that she won't let this affect her, that it can't hurt her, and I really wish they had played into that more. I wish Asuna would have resisted a little more. It would have given her a bigger role in the climax. But no, because why give Asuna any attention? It's all about Kirito. Sugo, of course, has to say some evil shit and asks her how long she'll keep her pride as he continues to assault her. He then talks about how he is going to do all this to her in the real world. And in the manga, he specifically says, "First, I shall steal the purity of your heart, and then I ruin the chastity of your body." What the fuck? First of all, we get it. He's evil and creepy. You already established that. Just stop. The writing makes this so much worse. Secondly, what he is implying there is rape. Plain and simple. There is a fine line that authors have to dance when discussing topics like this. In general, if you can avoid sensitive topics, then avoid them. If you have to discuss the topic, however, you have to treat the topic and the characters respectfully. Reki Kawahara does not. He does this to provide some twisted fan service and to make the odds seem impossible for Kirito. It's appalling. After this, Sugo does one of the weirdest things I've ever seen. He begins to lick Asuna's face. Why? I have no idea. It really doesn't make sense. Though nothing Sugo does makes sense. I would now like to take a moment to discuss the animation. I said earlier that the animation was good for the most part. Here's where I think the animation is really bad. The animation scene during the climax is so ugly. There are shots of Sugo's face that will haunt me for the rest of my life. Why draw it this way? I'm in no way an artistic expert, but I really do think that this is trash. The scenes of Sugo licking Asuna are also so incredibly creepy. Like, I seriously don't know why they thought animating it like this was a good idea. Some of the transitions between shots here are also really rough, and that can really break the audience's flow. The pacing of the climax is just really bad. I will say that despite not changing much from the anime, the manga was overall a better experience. the still images present in the manga made it much easier to read than watching the anime, but that's not really saying much. I also think the art was better overall, but that's neither here nor there. After all of that, Kirito passes out and wakes up in this white void. He starts to question his abilities before Kaiba appears. Somehow. He tells Kirito he can win and not to give up, blah blah blah. Kirito wakes up and miraculously gets up, catches Sugo's punch, then logs into Heathcliff's ID. Ladies and gentlemen, this is what we like to call a Deus Ex Machina! Reki Kawahara wrote his main character into a narrative hole, and the only way to get him out was to use one of the most cliche plot devices! Now, for those who are unfamiliar, a Deus Ex Machina is a plot device in which an artificial or contrived solution is used to solve a problem. It can be a person, object, maybe even a transformation. Usually, a Deus Ex Machina is a cheap way to solve a problem in a story, though there are certain ways to write it into a story well. For as many problems as it caused for the series, Super Saiyan would be considered a Deus Ex Machina that was done at least somewhat well. Now, Super Saiyan isn't the best transformation in anime history, but it's probably the most important. In Dragon Ball Z, Super Saiyan is built up as this power from legend which Frieza feared. Frieza, of course, wanted to suppress the Saiyans so that this power could never be achieved, allowing the Saiyans to rise up against him. We also see Goku trained to become stronger and face several fierce foes before fighting Frieza. And he gets his ass kicked! This all culminated in the last-ditch Spirit Bomb, which failed to kill Frieza. Frieza then kills Krillin and injures Piccolo, which ends up causing Goku to release his anger and turn into a Super Saiyan. Though it is a Deus Ex Machina, it's built up well enough to make it seem less contrived. This scene also produces quite a bit of tension in a way that would keep the audience hooked. But we don't get that in Fairy Dance. Kirito logging into Heathcliff's ID is just a way to get him out of a seemingly impossible situation. Anyways, Sugo attempts to call the Holy Sword Excalibur, but can't due to Kirito disabling his administrative permissions. Kirito then calls Excalibur himself and gives it to Sugo, clearly taking a moral high ground and being the honorable fighter. He also turns the pain absorbers down all the way to 0. The two fight, but I can hardly call this a fight. It's just Kirito wailing on Sugo. In any case, Kirito wins, putting Sugo in an immense amount of pain, making him look pathetic overall. Such a compelling villain. I would like to take a moment to discuss the references to mythology in ALO. Of course, we talked about Oberon and Titania earlier, but there are still several more. The world of ALO is, of course, based on Norse mythology. The 9 realms are present in the game, with Alfheim being one of them. The world tree is also from Norse mythology, along with some of the characters we see later on in the Caliber arc, such as Freya, aka Thor. Graham is also from Norse mythology, along with Mjolnir, which is also seen in the Caliber arc. Then, of course, we have Excalibur from Arthurian legend. Now, there is another reference to Arthurian legend in the Caliber arc in the form of the sword Caliburn. Caliburn is used as a fake version of Excalibur here, obtained in a quest. Excalibur itself is quite disappointing. It apparently gets mentioned by Leafa at some point while her and Kirito are traveling together, but I don't recall it ever getting mentioned. Either way, the quest is too difficult for them and they ignore it. The only time we get to see Excalibur is during the climax, and it's only to show Kirito taking the moral high ground by giving it to Sugo. There have been many stories that have used Excalibur in cool and unique ways. Excalibur is one of, if not the most popular weapon from mythology, and the story behind it is such an interesting tale. Countless shows, books, anime, you name it, have incorporated Excalibur and the legend of King Arthur. This might be the most boring use of Excalibur I've ever seen. It's relegating to nothing more than a way to glorify the main character. It sucks, because I do think the other references in mythology, makes sense in the context of a video game. Though they do lean into it a little too much during the Caliber arc, but I digress. I just wish that Excalibur was used in a more interesting way. After Kirito and Sugo's fight, Kirito frees Asuna and they have one last moment in the game before Asuna is finally logged out. Kirito talks to Kaiba and he gives him the Seed, which is a plot device meant to set up future VR MMO games to be made. Kirito logs out and Sugahara encourages him to visit Asuna. At the hospital, Kirito confronts Sugo one last time, just to show how pathetic Sugo is. Yippee! He visits Asuna, they finally kiss in real life. Then a few months later, the survivors of SAO meet, and they all have a party in ALO, now featuring a remade version of Aincrad. The end! There's so many issues with Fairy Dance, but I've saved its most egregious for last. I talked about Asuna's sexual assault earlier, but there's one final mistake made by Reki Kawahara when it comes to this scene. Its lack of impact. I've talked a little about how the events that happen in SAO rarely affect the characters or the world around them, but the worst case of this is with Asuna. Despite being trapped in a death game for 2 years, almost getting killed, then getting trapped in another game and being held captive there, in a cage, all the while being harassed and assaulted by someone she doesn't even like. All of that, and yet she doesn't even seem affected by this at all. Like it never even happened. Sugo assaulting her is never even brought up again as far as I'm aware. In fact, Sugo is barely brought up after the end of the arc. It's like Asuna forgot that she was assaulted. And therein lies the biggest problem with not only Fairy Dance, but the entirety of SAO. Nothing ever matters. This really hurts Asuna the most, as after the end of the Aincrad arc, she's relegated to nothing more than a side character only relevant when the plot needs her to be relevant. The only exceptions to this are the Progressive movies and Mother's Rosario. And wouldn't you know it, those are some of the best pieces of SAO media out there. Though Progressive turned out to be a little disappointing in the end, but still. Who would have thought making Asuna the protagonist would lend itself to a much more interesting story? There is so much wasted potential with Asuna, and it's actually upsetting. Instead of building on her character and developing her, she's instead relegated to the sidelines, even after everything that happens to her. You would think that there may be some sort of trauma caused by these tragic events, but no. Here, sexual assault is used for nothing more than fan service and a way to show off the MC's heroism. It's a disrespectful way to use this kind of subject matter, but Reki Kawahara keeps using it! There's an easy fix here. You can keep all the stuff with Sugo and Asuna, whatever. Then after the climax happens, you use it as an opportunity to show what that kind of traumatic event can do to a person mentally. You can show Asuna struggling with what happened to her, possibly with nightmares or being uncomfortable around certain people. Maybe she struggles to go back into ALO, and even when she's in there, maybe she starts having panic attacks. Part of her character arc could be trying to overcome this PTSD with the help of her friends and therapy. There's a lot you could do with this sort of storyline, but once again, it's a fine line to dance. I just wish that a little more thought and care had been put into this story. There are so many things wrong with this arc, from the terrible plot and unremarkable characters to the poorly written sexual assault. This arc is a prime example of how not to write a story. There were some good things in this arc. The beginning wasn't terrible, and there were a couple scenes that I really did like. Other than that, though, there really isn't much else to like about this arc. Most of the characters are completely irrelevant to the plot. The villain is there for no other reason than to be a creep and an obstacle to Kirito. And the main cast have barely any interesting character development, with it all culminating in a climax that doesn't even matter. Truly a menagerie of disappointment. I really do think that this arc has some potential to actually tell an interesting story. It's just a shame that all of it was wasted. I think that's about all I have to say. I know I rambled quite a bit in this video, and I do apologize, but there was just so much I had to say about Fairy Dance. I hope you all enjoyed my first video. I really hope that I can continue creating videos. If you did enjoy this video, I would really appreciate it if you liked and subscribed, and maybe share the video around. I do have a few more videos planned, but it will be quite a while before I'm able to make them. But I hope you all will stick around for them. Anyways, that's all for now. I hope to see you all around.